Margaret never thought much about aging until she turned 68. The birthdays had come and gone without much fuss, but one autumn morning, as she sat by the kitchen window with her tea cooling in her hands, something shifted. She felt it, in her bones, in the quiet that lingered long after the radio had been turned off. For decades, she had approached life with a steady determination. More vitamins, more exercise, more things to fix or do. If something felt off, she added something new. A supplement, a stretch, a stricter routine. But that morning, watching the leaves drift lazily from the maple in her yard, Margaret realized her body was no longer asking for more. It was asking for less. The realization was subtle, almost gentle. She noticed how tired she was, even after 8 hours of sleep, how her stomach fluttered uneasily after meals, how her shoulders never quite relaxed, even in silence. It wasn't illness, it was accumulation. Years of habits that had built up like clutter, mental, physical, emotional. She began to see clearly. Her path to health wouldn't come from adding more, but from letting go. It started small. She stopped reading the news first thing in the morning, replacing the noise with quiet time and a slow breakfast. She stopped accepting every lunch invitation that drained her energy. She stopped ignoring the aches that had become part of the background hum of daily life. She didn't do these things out of defeat, but out of care. Choosing less, not because she was giving up, but because she was finally ready to make space for what mattered. Friends noticed the change. Margaret smiled more, even laughed in moments she used to rush through. Her pace slowed, but she wasn't falling behind. She was catching up to herself. She started saying no without guilt. No to tension, to pressure, to expectations that no longer served her. In doing so, she created room for joy to return. Letting go didn't mean doing nothing. It meant doing less of what depleted her, and more of what restored her. A warm bath instead of a late-night snack. A quiet evening walk instead of scrolling through her phone. She didn't need a new routine. She needed fewer distractions from the peace already waiting inside her. It was, as she discovered, not a loss, but a return to balance, to breath, to herself. Margaret had always considered herself a worrier by nature. Even as a girl, she remembered lying in bed at night, thinking about things that hadn't happened. What if the dog ran away? What if the roof leaked? What if she said something wrong at school? That habit, though softened with age, never truly disappeared. But after her quiet revelation that fall morning, she began to notice just how much her mind was still pulling her in directions that led nowhere. She would catch herself fretting over the most ordinary things, whether she had locked the back door, if her neighbor thought she was being distant, whether she'd remembered to send that birthday card. Each small thought seemed harmless, but together they became a constant hum of unease in her chest. It was exhausting, not just mentally, but physically. Her sleep became lighter, her digestion slower, her days clouded by a strange, quiet tension. One afternoon, while reading in her favorite chair, Margaret came across a line in a novel. "Some thoughts don't deserve the dignity of your attention." The sentence struck her like a gentle bell. She set the book down, closed her eyes, and asked herself, how many thoughts today have I entertained that did nothing but steal my peace? The answer surprised her. Almost all of them. That was the moment she decided to change her relationship with worry. She didn't expect to stop worrying overnight, but she began to pay attention. When a fear rose, she asked herself, Is this real? Is it helpful? Is it mine to carry? More often than not, the answer was no. Instead of spiraling, she would take a breath and imagine setting the worry down like a heavy coat. She didn't need to wear it anymore. Margaret learned that peace wasn't something that arrived. It was something she chose. Over and over again, in the smallest of moments, she chose not to replay old conversations in her mind. She chose not to forecast the worst. She began to protect her energy like a precious resource. That meant fewer what-ifs and more what now. Her body responded almost immediately. Her chest felt lighter, her nights deeper. Even her morning tea tasted brighter. Worry hadn't disappeared, but it had lost its grip. And in its place grew space. Space for laughter, for stillness, for unexpected joy. She was no longer trying to outthink life. She was starting, for the first time in a long time, to simply live it. Margaret hadn't thought much about how often she sat, until she began noticing how stiff her knees felt every time she stood up. It wasn't pain, exactly. More like a quiet protest from her body, as if reminding her that it hadn't been designed to stay still for so long. After retiring, her days had gradually settled into a rhythm that, while peaceful, had become almost entirely sedentary. Morning tea by the window, a crossword puzzle at the kitchen table, reading on the couch after lunch, watching the news in the evening. She moved, yes, but in moments, not patterns. It was during a phone call with her daughter Emily that it clicked. Emily had laughed and said, "Mom, you sound like you've grown roots in that armchair." It was meant as a joke, but Margaret felt the truth beneath the words. She had grown roots, comfortable, quiet ones, but they were slowly wrapping around her joints, tightening her muscles, dimming her energy. The next day, Margaret did something unusual. She set a kitchen timer for 30 minutes. When it rang, she stood up. At first, she didn't know what to do, just stood awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure of how to move in a way that felt natural. But then she remembered a song she loved from the 70s, and on a whim, she asked her smart speaker to play it. As the familiar tune filled the air, she let herself sway gently, then step side to side, then lift her arms just a little. It wasn't exercise. It was joy. That small change became her ritual. Every 30 minutes, a gentle bell reminded her, move, stretch, breathe. She would walk slowly through the house, do light stretches by the window, even balance on her toes while brushing her teeth. These were not workouts. They were moments of reconnection, little reminders that her body was still hers, still capable, still willing. And something unexpected happened. Margaret's mind became clearer. Her mood lifted. She began sleeping more soundly. Even her digestion improved. It was as if her entire system had been waiting for her to re-engage, to remember that vitality isn't found in grand gestures, but in tiny, steady ones. She no longer saw movement as something to fit in. It became the rhythm of her life. Folding laundry to music, gardening for 15 minutes, walking in place during commercials. Margaret had returned to motion, not through discipline, but through delight. And in that movement, she found not just strength, but renewal. Margaret had always believed in a warm meal before bed. It reminded her of childhood, her mother's cocoa, a slice of toast, the soft quiet of the kitchen. So even into her 70s, she kept the habit alive. A small plate of cheese and crackers, a spoonful of jam, sometimes even a slice of pie. It brought comfort. But as the years passed, her sleep grew less restful. She'd wake in the night feeling heavy, bloated, and strangely foggy come morning. At first, She blamed age. That's just how it is now, she thought. But one night, after watching a documentary about circadian rhythms, something in her shifted. The program explained how the body slows down after sunset, how digestion becomes sluggish, and how eating too late can disturb the body's ability to repair itself. Margaret paused the screen and stared into the reflection of her empty teacup. Was my comfort causing me discomfort? The thought was uncomfortable, but honest. The next evening, she decided to try something different. She finished her dinner by 6 p.m., a hearty soup and a piece of warm bread, and then made a cup of chamomile tea. As night fell, she felt a surprising sense of calm. Her body didn't feel weighed down. Her thoughts didn't race. That night, she slept through without waking once. It wasn't magic, but it was noticeable. And the next morning, she felt clearer, lighter, curious. Over the next week, Margaret made it her quiet experiment. No more snacks after dinner. Just tea, maybe a book, or soft music. She noticed patterns, how her stomach felt more at ease, how her energy returned more naturally in the morning, how her mind seemed less cluttered. Even her cravings started to change. What once felt like hunger now seemed more like habit, and with patience, even that softened. She didn't feel deprived. In fact, she felt freer, like her body had been waiting for her to listen. The weight in her midsection eased, and her mood became more stable. Her evening rituals changed too. More walks at sunset, a bath by candlelight, earlier bedtimes. She wasn't dieting. She was aligning. Margaret began to see food differently, not as reward or routine, but as rhythm. She respected her body's signals. When it said, "Enough," she listened. And in doing so, she discovered that peace after dinner wasn't just about digestion. It was about rest, recovery, and the quiet pleasure of letting her body do what it was meant to do, heal in the dark, uninterrupted. There was a time Margaret thought strength meant silence. Raised in a household where emotions were folded neatly away like linens, she learned early on that expressing sadness made others uncomfortable, and that anger was something to swallow, not show. So she carried her feelings quietly. She smiled when she was hurting, nodded when she wanted to cry, kept peace at the cost of her own. It became second nature, as automatic as breathing. But with age, the weight of all that unspoken feeling began to show, not just in her mood, but in her body. Her shoulders were always tight. Sleep was often restless. Her heart would sometimes race for no reason. She didn't connect it to emotion. Until, one evening, during her weekly phone call with her niece, she found herself tearing up while talking about an old friend who had passed. "I never really cried for her," she said quietly, surprised by her own voice. "I think I just tucked it away." That night, Margaret sat in her living room, the house dim and still, and let herself feel. Really feel. She remembered her friend's laugh, her warmth, the little notes she used to leave in the mailbox just to say hello. And the tears came, not as a breakdown, but as a gentle release. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't resist. She let it happen. And afterward, her body felt lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. From then on, she began to explore her feelings, not with drama, but with kindness. If she felt sad, she wrote in her journal. If something upset her, she talked about it, even if only to herself. She began to notice when her chest tightened or her stomach churned and asked, "What am I holding right now?" Sometimes it was grief, sometimes frustration, sometimes just the ache of being human. Margaret learned that feeling wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. A way for her body to speak when words didn't come. She didn't need to justify her emotions or explain them. She only needed to honor them. And when she did, something beautiful happened. Her relationships deepened. Her laughter became freer. Her days felt more real. Letting herself feel didn't mean being overwhelmed. It meant being honest, being whole. She no longer tried to be fine all the time. She simply was. Sometimes joyful, sometimes tender, always true. In making space for her emotions, Margaret reclaimed a part of herself she didn't even know was missing. And in that honesty, she found a quiet kind of strength that no silence had ever given her. Margaret had never considered sleep to be anything special. It was just something that happened at the end of the day, if it came at all. In her younger years, she'd often push through exhaustion, staying up to finish chores or answer late-night emails. And even after retirement, she kept that same habit. One more show, one more chapter, one more scroll through her phone. Sleep, she believed, could wait. But over time, the cost became hard to ignore. She began waking up groggy, even after 8 hours in bed. Her memory wasn't as sharp. She felt more irritable, and her joints ached more than usual. It wasn't just tiredness. It was wear. Her body, it seemed, was asking for something deeper than rest. It was asking for restoration. One evening, after dinner, Margaret sat quietly in her favorite chair and watched the light fade from the sky. She noticed how her eyelids felt heavier than usual. Instead of pushing through the sensation, she listened. She turned off the television. She lit a candle. She let the house grow quiet with her. And when she climbed into bed at 9:15, nearly an hour earlier than usual, her body sighed in relief. The sleep that followed was different. It was deeper, less interrupted. She awoke before dawn, not with a start, but with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts were clearer, her breathing steadier. It wasn't just rest, it was repair. From that point on, Margaret began to treat sleep with a reverence she once reserved only for guests or holidays. She created rituals, dimming the lights an hour before bed, sipping warm herbal tea, rubbing lavender oil into her hands. She stopped bringing her phone into the bedroom. She stopped chasing sleep like it was a prize to win. Instead, she welcomed it like an old friend. She also noticed how much her sleep depended on her day. A late cup of coffee, a stressful phone, call, too much sugar after dinner, all of it rippled into the night. So she adjusted. Not perfectly, but intentionally. She learned to protect her evenings, to soften them, and her body responded with gratitude. Margaret began to understand that aging wasn't about slowing down. It was about knowing when to pause. Sleep wasn't a weakness. It was a quiet, powerful form of self-respect. Each night, as she slipped between cool sheets and let her eyes close with ease, she whispered, "Thank you." Not to the day, but to herself, for finally learning to listen. The silence in Margaret's house wasn't loud. It was soft, almost gentle, but it lingered. Her days were filled with quiet routines, folding laundry, tending to plants, making tea. And while there was comfort in the calm, there were moments when the stillness felt heavy. After her husband passed and her children moved out of state, Margaret assured everyone she was fine. "I like my solitude," she'd say. And it was true. But even solitude, in excess, can become something else, something colder. It wasn't until a Wednesday morning, while reaching for a jar on a high shelf, that it struck her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, full laugh. That realization settled over her like dust on an untouched table. She had grown accustomed to being alone. But was she thriving or just surviving? Later that day, she received a card from her neighbor's daughter thanking her for watching their cat the week before. On a whim, Margaret walked next door with a plate of muffins and knocked. The visit was brief, warm, full of small talk and shared smiles. But afterward, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Lightness. The kind that follows connection, however small. Encouraged, Margaret began reaching out more. A call to her sister on Sunday mornings, a walk with an old friend twice a month. She joined a local book circle that met every other Tuesday. These weren't grand social gestures, just steady ones. Her world, once narrowed to the walls of her home, began to stretch, gently, quietly, like the sun reaching into a shadowed room. The effects were immediate. Her energy lifted. Her mood evened out. Meals felt more enjoyable when she knew she'd speak to someone afterward. Even her sleep improved. Margaret realized that while she didn't need constant company, she needed connection. We all do. Not for entertainment, but for nourishment, for the deep, human sense of belonging. What surprised her most wasn't how good it felt to reconnect, but how easy it became once she started. A smile at the market, a shared joke with the pharmacist, a wave to the boy who delivered her groceries. Each interaction, however brief, stitched her more fully back into the fabric of life. Margaret didn't need crowds or constant chatter. She just needed reminders, small and steady, that she was still part of something, that her presence mattered. And as her heart opened, not with noise, but with warmth, she discovered what loneliness had almost hidden: the quiet power of being seen.